Hi. This is Moonlit Inc. BL. Let's dive in tonight's story where a touch-starved CEO finds his North Star. Let's begin. Prologue. The Ice King was not born, he was carved, layer by layer, in the sterile silence of the Cantarella estate. Long before Keith became the architect of a billion-dollar empire, he was a child of marble and glass. His parents, Marcus and Elena, viewed affection as a structural weakness, a messy, unnecessary complication in the lineage of a dynasty. To them, a child was an asset to be polished, not a soul to be held. His education was a series of elite, private tutors who cycled through the estate like ghosts. There were no playgrounds, no skinned knees, no messy collisions with other children in the dirt. Homeschooling was a tactical isolation. Keith learned Mandarin, multivariable calculus, and corporate law before he ever learned the weight of a friend's hand on his shoulder. His childhood was a desert of physical contact. A handshake from his father upon a perfect exam score was the height of intimacy. A brief, dry kiss on the forehead from his mother before a gala was the only warmth he knew, and even that felt performed, a checked box on a list of parental duties. He grew up in a house where the servants wore gloves and his parents spoke in hushed, analytical tones. He learned early that to crave a hug was to admit a deficit. So, he buried the craving. He built a mental fortress where need was a dirty word and touch was a vulnerability used by the weak to distract the strong. By the time he took the helm of Cantarella Holdings, the isolation had become his skin. He moved through the world like a man behind a pane of reinforced glass, visible, brilliant, but entirely unreachable. But the body has a memory that the mind tries to kill. In the quiet hours of his 34th year, the Ice King began to crack. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, agonizing erosion. His hands would tremble during late-night mergers. His chest would tighten in a way that no doctor could explain with a scan. It was skin hunger, a primal, starving ache for the one thing his millions couldn't buy, the simple, grounding weight of another human being who didn't want a piece of his company. He didn't need a lover, he needed a tether. He didn't need a conversation, he needed to be reminded that he was made of flesh and blood, not just balance sheets and cold ambition. And so, with a shaking hand and a burner phone, the most powerful man in the city reached out to the only place that promised him a ghost of the warmth he'd been denied since birth. Hi. This is Moonlit Inc. BL. Let's dive in tonight's story where a touch-starved CEO finds his North Star. Let's begin. Prologue. The Ice King was not born, he was carved, layer by layer, in the sterile silence of the Cantarella estate. Long before Keith became the architect of a billion-dollar empire, he was a child of marble and glass. His parents, Marcus and Elena, viewed affection as a structural weakness, a messy, unnecessary complication in the lineage of a dynasty. To them, a child was an asset to be polished, not a soul to be held. His education was a series of elite, private tutors who cycled through the estate like ghosts. There were no playgrounds, no skinned knees, no messy collisions with other children in the dirt. Homeschooling was a tactical isolation. Keith learned Mandarin, multivariable calculus, and corporate law before he ever learned the weight of a friend's hand on his shoulder. His childhood was a desert of physical contact. A handshake from his father upon a perfect exam score was the height of intimacy. A brief, dry kiss on the forehead from his mother before a gala was the only warmth he knew, and even that felt performed, a checked box on a list of parental duties. He grew up in a house where the servants wore gloves and his parents spoke in hushed, analytical tones. He learned early that to crave a hug was to admit a deficit. So, he buried the craving. He built a mental fortress where need was a dirty word and touch was a vulnerability used by the weak to distract the strong. By the time he took the helm of Cantarella Holdings, the isolation had become his skin. He moved through the world like a man behind a pane of reinforced glass, visible, brilliant, but entirely unreachable. But the body has a memory that the mind tries to kill. In the quiet hours of his 34th year, the Ice King began to crack. It wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, agonizing erosion. His hands would tremble during late-night mergers. His chest would tighten in a way that no doctor could explain with a scan. It was skin hunger, a primal, starving ache for the one thing his millions couldn't buy, the simple, grounding weight of another human being who didn't want a piece of his company. He didn't need a lover, he needed a tether. He didn't need a conversation, he needed to be reminded that he was made of flesh and blood, not just balance sheets and cold ambition. And so, with a shaking hand and a burner phone, the most powerful man in the city reached out to the only place that promised him a ghost of the warmth he'd been denied since birth. Chapter 1, The Ice King's Shadow. The 42nd floor hallway of the Obsidian Tower smelled of expensive floor wax and filtered oxygen. Justin checked the fit of the silicone mask in the reflection of a darkened glass door. The Ren persona was a masterpiece of prosthetic engineering, soft, poor-textured skin that moved with his own muscles, giving him the appearance of a handsome, nondescript man with a slightly broader jaw and a permanent, neutral calm. As long as he stayed silent, the illusion was bulletproof. He adjusted the collar of his high-necked black silk shirt and pressed the biometric scanner for the private executive suite. He'd been told this was a black-tier client, someone whose privacy was worth more than Justin's annual salary as a marketing analyst. The door hissed open. The suite was vast, shadowed, and cold. The only light came from the jagged skyline of the city bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows. Standing by the glass was a silhouette Justin recognized with a physical jolt that nearly knocked the wind out of him. Broad shoulders, tailored charcoal trousers, and a posture so rigid it looked like it would snap if the wind changed direction. Keith Cantarella. Justin's pulse didn't just quicken, it thrashed against his ribs. This was the man who, only 4 hours ago, had tossed Justin's quarterly report back across a mahogany desk with a single, devastating sentence: "I asked for insight, Mistra, not a middle school summary." The Ice King of Cantarella Holdings was now standing 5 feet away, his back turned, looking utterly defeated. "You're late," Keith said. His voice, usually a sharp blade in the boardroom, sounded frayed at the edges, like old velvet. Justin didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply inclined his head, a practiced, professional gesture of submission, and waited in the designated neutral zone near the plush, oversized divan. Keith turned around. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them bruised purple against his pale skin. He looked at Ren without seeing Justin. To Keith, this was just a high-priced service, a human-weighted blanket bought to stave off the tremors in his hands. "I don't want to talk," Keith muttered, rubbing his face. "The agency said you're a specialist in silence. That's why I picked you." Justin nodded again, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the silicone of his throat. Keith approached him slowly. The man who dictated the flow of billions of dollars across the globe was hesitating. He stopped a foot away, the scent of expensive bourbon and cedarwood rolling off him. Then, with a shuddering breath that sounded like a sob caught in his throat, Keith leaned forward. He didn't grab. He didn't demand. He simply let his forehead drop onto Justin's shoulder. The weight was staggering. It wasn't just physical, it was the psychic weight of a man who had been starved of human touch for years. Justin felt Keith's hands reach up, grasping the fabric of Justin's sleeves, his fingers trembling so violently that Justin could feel it through his own skin. "Just, hold me," Keith whispered into the crook of Justin's neck. "Please. Before I lose my mind." Justin reached up, his movements fluid and practiced despite the screaming panic in his brain. He wrapped his arms around his boss, pulling the CEO's trembling frame flush against his chest. As Keith's entire body went limp in his arms, dissolving from a ruthless executive into a desperate, tactile ghost, Justin realized the terrifying truth: he was currently holding the most powerful man he knew, and he had never felt more in danger of being destroyed. Chapter 2, The First Contact. The transition from the standing embrace to the divan felt like navigating a minefield in slow motion. Justin guided Keith toward the oversized leather couch, his movements fluid and anchored, despite the frantic drumming of his pulse. They settled into a spooning position, the most requested for deep pressure therapy. Justin sat back against the firm cushions, his legs parted to allow Keith to fit between them. The CEO, a man who usually occupied space with the predatory grace of a shark, now curled into Justin's chest as if he were trying to disappear into the fabric of his shirt. The silence in the suite was absolute, save for the hum of the HVAC and the ragged, uneven cadence of Keith's breathing. Justin began the rhythmic grounding technique. He placed one broad hand over Keith's sternum, feeling the frantic thud-thud-thud of a heart that seemed to be running a marathon while sitting still, and the other on Keith's shoulder. He began to breathe deeply, a slow, deliberate 4-7-8 count, exaggerating the rise and fall of his chest to force Keith's body to synchronize. It took 3 minutes. Then, the first crack in the Ice King's armor appeared. Keith's shoulders, usually hiked up to his ears in a permanent defensive crouch, finally dropped. A long, shuddering exhale escaped him, a sound that was half sigh, half moan of relief. He tilted his head back, resting the crown of his dark hair against Justin's collarbone. "You're remarkably steady," Keith murmured. His voice was thick, stripped of its boardroom iron. "The last one," she kept fidgeting. "Trying to make small talk." "I don't want to talk. I want to forget I have a voice." Justin tightened his grip slightly, a silent affirmation. He traced the line of Keith's arm with his thumb, a repetitive, soothing motion. He felt the fine wool of Keith's custom suit beneath his fingers, but beneath that, he felt the heat of the man, a furnace of neglected humanity. "My lead analyst looked at me today like I was a monster," Keith whispered into the shadows of the room. "Maybe I am. I fired 3 people before lunch. I didn't even remember their names." Justin flinched internally. "I remember them, Keith. They were in my department." Keith didn't notice the microtension. He was too far gone in the sensory overload of being held. He turned slightly, burying his face in the crook of Justin's neck, his nose brushing the edge of the silicone mask. Justin froze, his breath hitching. The mask was seamless, but at this proximity, the heat of another person's skin could sometimes soften the medical adhesive. "You smell like ozone and rain," Keith muttered, his eyes fluttering shut. "It's familiar." "Why is it familiar?" Justin's heart nearly stopped. It was his laundry detergent, a cheap, fresh linen brand he'd used for years. He hadn't realized the scent would cling to him so stubbornly. He immediately shifted his weight, subtly moving his neck away and refocusing Keith's attention by pressing his palm more firmly against Keith's side. The CEO let out a soft, broken sound and gripped Justin's forearm, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't just cuddling, he was clinging to an anchor in a storm. "Don't let go," Keith commanded, though it sounded more like a plea. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes of being a person. As Justin held the man who had mocked his marketing strategy only hours before, he felt a dangerous wave of empathy wash over him. The Ice King wasn't made of stone, he was made of glass, and he was covered in hairline fractures. Chapter 3, The Desk and the Divan. The fluorescent lights of the marketing floor felt like a physical assault after the amber-dimmed sanctuary of Keith's private suite. Justin sat at his workstation, his fingers hovering over a mechanical keyboard that felt too loud, too sterile. Every time he blinked, he felt the ghost weight of Keith's head against his shoulder. His skin still hummed from the proximity, a sensory hangover that made the professional distance between them feel like a jagged canyon. "Mistra. My office. Now." The voice barked over the intercom, cutting through the low hum of the office. It was the daytime Keith, sharp, impatient, and encased in an invisible suit of armor. Justin stood, smoothing his tie. He felt like a spy walking into a trap. As he entered the executive office, the midday sun blazed through the same floor-to-ceiling windows he'd watched the moon through only hours before. Keith was standing behind his desk, looking immaculate in a navy 3-piece suit. There was no sign of the man who had trembled in the dark. "This merger with Sterling Vane is leaking oil," Keith said, not looking up from a tablet. The brand sentiment analysis you turned in this morning is soft. It lacks the killer instinct we need to suppress their board. Justin took a breath, his heart doing that familiar, frantic dance. I was prioritizing long-term consumer trust over short-term market aggression, Mr. Cantarella. If we alienate the... I don't pay you for trust, Justin. I pay you for dominance. Keith finally looked up. His eyes, usually cold blue chips of ice, narrowed. He stepped closer, invading Justin's personal space in a way that felt entirely different from the night before. This was a power play, not a plea. But then, Keith stopped. He leaned in slightly, his nostrils flaring. Justin's blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The detergent. Keith's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. For a fraction of a second, the predatory CEO vanished, replaced by the vulnerable man from the divan. He looked at Justin, really looked at him, searching for a connection he couldn't quite name. What is that scent? Keith asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing its jagged edge. Scent, sir. Justin managed, his voice steady despite the internal screaming. Never mind, Keith snapped, shaking his head as if clearing a fog. He stepped back, the mask of the Ice King sliding back into place with terrifying speed. Get back to your desk. Fix the report. I want it on my desk by 6 p.m. I have an appointment this evening, and I won't be disturbed. An appointment with me, Justin thought, a bittersweet ache blooming in his chest. The rest of the day was a blur of spreadsheets and caffeine. The tension was suffocating. Every time Keith walked past the marketing bay, Justin felt a pull, a magnetic, dangerous urge to reach out and steady the man's hands, which he knew would be shaking the moment the elevators closed. That night, when Justin returned to the suite as Ren, the atmosphere had shifted. Keith didn't wait for the formal greeting. He was already sitting on the edge of the bed, his tie undone, his hair disheveled. You're early, Keith whispered. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. Justin didn't nod this time. He walked straight to Keith and sat beside him, offering his hand. Keith took it immediately, his fingers interlaced with Justin's in a grip that was almost painful. Work was unbearable today, Keith confessed, leaning his forehead against Justin's masked temple. Everyone wants a piece of me. Everyone is looking for a weakness. Except you. You just exist here. With me. Justin squeezed his hand, the silence between them heavy with the things he couldn't say. He wanted to tell Keith that he saw the weakness and didn't find it revolting. He wanted to tell him that the soft marketing report was an act of protection, not incompetence. Instead, he pulled Keith back into the shadows of the divan, the analyst and the CEO disappearing into the quiet safety of the Cuddler and the client. Chapter 4, Fragile Boundaries. The fourth session was different from the start. The air in the suite felt charged, heavy with an atmospheric pressure that signaled a coming storm. Keith hadn't just been working, he had been fighting. The Sterling Vein merger was turning into a bloodbath, and the Ice King was returning to his sanctuary with cracks in his marble facade that no amount of corporate stoicism could hide. When Justin entered, Keith didn't wait for the neutral zone ritual. He was already pacing, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his movements jagged. Sit, Keith commanded, then immediately flinched at his own tone. Please. Just sit. Justin moved to the oversized velvet armchair, a piece deep enough for two. He settled in, and Keith practically fell into him. But tonight, Keith wasn't looking for the quiet spooning of previous sessions. He was restless. He shifted, his head lolling against Justin's chest, his hands roaming Justin's forearms as if searching for a pulse, a sign of life, a tether. My analyst, Mistra, he argued with me today, Keith murmured, his voice vibrating against Justin's ribs. He looked at me with those damn eyes. Like he felt sorry for me. I should fire him for the insubordination alone. Justin's heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. He kept his breathing rhythmic, a silent anchor, but his fingers twitched involuntarily against Keith's shoulder. But I didn't, Keith continued, a bitter chuckle bubbling in his throat. Because for some reason, when he's in the room, the air feels breathable. Like it does here. With you. It's infuriating. The irony was a physical weight. Justin reached up, moving his hand to Keith's hair, threading his fingers through the dark, silken strands in a slow, grounding motion. It was a risk, touching a client's head was intimate, almost dangerously so, but Keith let out a long, broken hum of approval. Then, the world tilted. Keith turned his face upward, looking at the rent mask. In the dim, amber glow of the floor lamps, the silicone looked hauntingly real, but Keith's eyes were narrowed, sharp with a sudden, obsessive focus. "Who are you?" Keith whispered. "Under this. Why won't you speak to me? I pay for your time, but I feel like I'm holding a ghost." Before Justin could react, Keith reached up. His thumb brushed the underside of Justin's jaw, right where the edge of the prosthetic transitioned into the skin of his neck. Justin froze. His entire body turned to stone. The adhesive there was strong, but Keith's touch was lingering, tracing the line of his throat with a curiosity that was rapidly turning into an investigation. "Your skin, it's so warm here," Keith muttered, his thumb hooking slightly under the invisible seam of the mask. "But up here, it's different." He began to apply a tiny amount of pressure, a gentle tugging that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Justin's system. If he pulled back now, it would look suspicious. If he stayed, the mask might lift. The silence stretched, suffocating and thick. Justin could see the reflection of his own masked face in Keith's blown-out pupils. He saw the desperation there. Keith wasn't trying to catch him, he was trying to find something real to hold on to. In a moment of pure, panicked instinct, Justin leaned down and pressed his masked forehead against Keith's, closing his eyes. He took Keith's hand, the one threatening the seam of the mask, and moved it firmly to his own heart. "Listen," the gesture said. "I am real. My heart is beating. That is all you need to know." Keith let out a shaky breath, his fingers curling into the fabric of Justin's shirt, right over the thundering heartbeat. The immediate danger passed as Keith slumped back, the urge to unmask replaced by the sheer exhaustion of his own emotions. "I'm sorry," Keith rasped, closing his eyes. "I'm losing my grip. Don't leave. Please. Just stay until I fall asleep." Justin held him, his own hands trembling now. He had survived the encounter, but the boundary had been breached. The Ice King was no longer satisfied with a shadow, he was starting to hunt for the man beneath. Chapter 5, The Merger Meltdown. The breaking point didn't happen in the dark. It happened at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, under the sterile, humming glare of the boardroom's LED panels. The Sterling Vane merger had collapsed. A rival firm had swooped in with a predatory counteroffer, leaking internal memos that painted Keith as a volatile liability. Justin sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, clutching a tablet, watching his boss's composure disintegrate in real time. Keith didn't scream. He didn't throw chairs. Instead, he went unnervingly still. His face turned a ghostly, porcelain white, and his hands, those hands Justin had held just hours before, began to shake. Not a tremor, but a violent, rhythmic shudder that he tried to hide by gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned the color of bone. "Out," Keith said. The word was a low, jagged rasp. "Mr. Cantarella, we need to discuss the PR response," the legal VP started. "Out." The roar shook the glass walls. The room cleared in a panicked scramble. Justin was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back. Keith was slumped in his leather chair, his head bowed, his breath coming in shallow, hitching gasps. For a terrifying second, Justin almost stepped back in. He almost reached out as Justin. He forced himself to walk away. 20 minutes later, Justin's personal phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an encrypted alert from the Aura agency. Urgent, client 009, Black Tier, requests immediate unscheduled session. Location, private suite. Obsidian Tower. Code red, emotional distress. Justin didn't think. He didn't check out. He walked to the stairwell, stripped off his work blazer, and sprinted to his car. In the back seat, he performed the frantic ritual he'd mastered, the medical-grade adhesive, the alignment of the silicone edges, the cooling spray that set the run mask into a second skin. He re-entered the Obsidian Tower through the service elevator, his heart performing a frantic percussion against his ribs. When he swiped into the suite, the smell hit him first, spilled scotch and the metallic tang of a panic attack. The room was a wreck. A floor lamp had been overturned. Keith was on the floor, tucked into the narrow space between the divan and the window, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked small. The most powerful man in the city had shrunk into a terrified child. Justin didn't hesitate. He dropped to the floor, discarding the professional, neutral zone distance entirely. He crawled into the cramped space and wrapped himself around Keith from behind, pulling the man's rigid back against his chest. Keith let out a sound, a broken, high-pitched whimper that fractured Justin's soul. "You came," Keith choked out. He turned in Justin's arms, burying his face in the silk of Justin's shirt, his fingers digging into Justin's shoulders with bruising force. I thought I was going to die. I couldn't breathe. Everything is falling apart. They're all waiting for me to fail." Justin pulled him closer, his arms of ice, his chin resting on the top of Keith's head. He began a rhythmic rocking motion, a primal form of comfort. He felt Keith's hot tears soaking through his shirt, hitting his actual skin beneath the fabric. "I fired him," Keith sobbed, his voice muffled. "I fired Mistra. I told him to get out. I told everyone to get out. Why did I do that? He was the only one who looked at me like I was human." Justin's heart stopped. "He thinks he fired me." In the heat of the boardroom collapse, Keith's memory had blurred his lashing out into a total severance. Keith pulled back just enough to look at the mask. His eyes were wild, searching. "You don't judge me, do you, Ren? You're the only thing that's real. Everything else is a lie. The money, the tower, the board, it's all ash." Keith reached up, his hands cupping the Ren face. His thumbs brushed the synthetic cheeks, his touch desperate and reverent. "I need you. I don't care what it costs. Stay the night. Please. If I'm alone tonight, I won't make it to morning." Justin couldn't speak, but he leaned in, pressing his masked cheek against Keith's wet one. It was an agonizing paradox. He had never been closer to Keith, and yet, the man he loved was mourning the loss of Justin while clinging to a mask. Chapter 6, The Recognition Glitch. The sun rose over the city like a spotlight on a crime scene. Justin had barely managed to peel himself away from Keith's sleeping form at 4 a.m., slipping out of the penthouse and shedding the Run persona in the back seat of his sedan. The transition back to Justin Mistra, the fired marketing analyst, was a jarring, nauseating blur of cold coffee and adrenaline. He stood in the lobby of the Obsidian Tower at 8:30 a.m., his badge clutched in a sweaty palm. He expected the turnstile to turn red. He expected security to escort him out. Instead, it beeped a cheerful green. He rode the elevator up in a trance. The marketing floor was a tomb. Co-workers whispered behind monitors, their eyes darting to Keith's closed office door. Justin sat at his desk, staring at a blank screen, waiting for the axe to fall. "Mistra." The voice wasn't a bark this time. It was a hollow rasp. Keith was standing in his doorway, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that Justin had held just hours ago. Keith looked like he'd been through a war. "In my office," Keith said, then turned and vanished inside. Justin followed, his legs feeling like lead. When the door clicked shut, the silence was heavy. Keith was standing by the window, the same window where Ren had held him while he wept. I said some things yesterday, Keith began, his back still turned. The board meeting. The collapse. I was not myself. Mr. Cantarella, you don't have to apologize, Justin said softly. Keith turned around. He looked at Justin, and for a heart-stopping second, his eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, closing the distance until he was within Justin's personal space. He leaned in, his nostrils flaring slightly, just as he had before. He was hunting for that scent. The ozone. The rain. The smell of the only person who didn't fear him. I thought I fired you, Keith whispered, his gaze dropping to Justin's mouth, then back to his eyes. In my head, you were gone. I spent the night, mourning a phantom. Justin didn't move. He couldn't. I'm still here, sir. Keith reached out, his hand hovering near Justin's shoulder. He hesitated, his fingers twitching in the air, mimicking the exact movement he had made as he reached for Ren in the dark. The glitch was happening. The muscle memory of Keith's body was recognizing the man in front of him, even if his conscious mind was still trapped behind the logic of the mask. You have a specific way of breathing, Justin, Keith said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, intimate register. It's steady. Even when I'm being a bastard. Even when the world is ending. Why are you so steady? Someone has to be, Justin replied, his heart hammering a rhythm that he knew Keith would recognize if he just leaned an inch closer. Keith's hand finally landed on Justin's shoulder. He gripped it, not with the iron authority of a boss, but with a desperate, searching pressure. He leaned in, his forehead almost touching Justin's. I had a visitor last night, Keith confessed, his eyes searching Justin's for a reaction. Someone I pay to keep me sane. And yet, sitting here looking at you, I feel the same pull. It's making me feel like I'm losing my mind. How can two completely different people feel like the same breath of air? Justin felt the heat of Keith's skin. The secret was clawing at his throat, begging to be let out. He wanted to drop the act. He wanted to tell Keith that there were no two people, there was only the man who loved him and the man who held him. Maybe, Justin whispered, his voice trembling, you're just finally starting to see me. Keith flinched as if burned. He pulled his hand back, the Ice King mask slamming back into place, though it was crooked and cracked. Get out, Keith snapped, though there was no venom in it, only terror. Fix the sterling vein counterproposal. I want it by 5. And Justin. Justin paused at the door. Don't wear that cologne anymore. It's distracting. But I'm not wearing any. Justin thought as he stepped into the hallway, leaning his back against the cool glass. He was being hunted by his own shadow. Chapter 7, The Unmasking Threat. The 7th session didn't feel like a sanctuary, it felt like an interrogation room. When Justin entered the suite as Ren, the atmosphere was thick with a new, jagged energy. Keith wasn't waiting on the divan or staring out the window. He was sitting at a small table, a single lamp illuminating a glass of amber liquid and a folder of documents. He looked at Justin, not with the relief of a drowning man, but with the piercing intensity of a prosecutor. Sit, Keith said. He didn't move to embrace him. Justin sat, his hands folded in his lap, his silence now a heavy shield. He could feel Keith's eyes scanning him, tracing the line of his shoulders, the height of his posture, the way his fingers rested against his thighs. Keith was looking for a match. He was looking for the marketing analyst in the silhouette of the cuddler. I've spent $3 million on market research this year, Keith began, his voice low and dangerous. I'm an expert at identifying patterns. At spotting the outlier. And right now, Ren, you are a glaring statistical impossibility. Keith stood and began to pace. I touch you, and my heart rate stabilizes. I look at Justin Mistra across a boardroom table, and the same thing happens. I smell a specific detergent on a professional who doesn't speak, and then I smell it on a man who challenges my business strategy. He stopped directly in front of Justin. The height difference was negligible, but Keith's aura was suffocating. There are two options, Keith whispered, leaning down until his face was inches from the mask. Either I am suffering a psychotic break brought on by the stress of the merger, or you are playing a very, very dangerous game with me. Justin remained motionless, though his pulse was a thundering riot beneath his skin. He had to maintain the persona. He tilted his head slightly, the "run" gesture for "I don't understand," but Keith didn't buy it. "Don't do that," Keith hissed. "Don't give me the silent treatment. Not tonight." Suddenly, Keith reached out. He didn't go for a hug. He grabbed Justin's wrist, pulling it upward. He stared at the hand, Justin's hand, noting the shape of the nails, the small scar on the thumb from a kitchen accident 3 years ago. "I know these hands," Keith rasped. His eyes were wide, bordering on manic. "I've seen them holding a stylus. I've seen them trembling under my gaze in the office." He let go of the wrist and reached for the edge of the mask. Justin flinched back, but Keith was faster. He pinned Justin against the back of the chair, his forearm pressing against Justin's chest, not to hurt, but to hold him still. "Show me," Keith commanded. "If you're just a stranger, if you're just a service I bought, then prove it. Take it off. Prove to me that I haven't been falling for my own employee in the dark. Because if I'm wrong, I'm insane. But if I'm right." Keith's voice broke, the obsession softening into a desperate, raw vulnerability. "If I'm right, it means I'm not alone. It means someone actually saw me, the real me, and chose to stay." His fingers hooked under the edge of the silicone at the jawline. Justin felt the adhesive pull, the cool air of the room hitting the sweat-slicked skin of his actual neck. The "Ren" mask began to lift, a physical peeling away of the lie. Justin had two choices: he could fight his boss off and flee into the night, ending his career and this connection forever. Or he could let the mask fall. Chapter 8, The Truth in the Dark. The sound of the adhesive peeling was deafening in the vacuum of the suite. It was a wet, surgical sound, the tearing away of a second skin, the death of a ghost. Justin didn't fight it. He reached up, his own fingers trembling as they met Keith's at the jawline. For a heartbeat, their hands hovered together, tangled at the seam of the lie. Then, Justin took over. With a slow, steady pull, he unhooked the silicone from behind his ears and peeled the face of "Run" away. The mask slumped in his lap, a hollowed-out shell of a man. Justin kept his head down for a moment, his real skin prickling as the cool air hit his damp cheeks. He took a single, ragged breath, his first honest breath in this room, and then he looked up. Keith didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He stood over Justin, his forearms still braced against the chair, frozen in the posture of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey only to realize the prey was someone he loved. "Justin," Keith whispered. The name didn't sound like a command or a critique. It sounded like a prayer. "It was always me," Justin said. His voice was cracked, rusty from weeks of professional silence. Hearing his own voice in this suite felt like breaking a window in a library. "From the first night. I didn't know it was you until I walked through that door, Keith. And by then, it was too late to leave." Keith's hand traveled from the edge of the chair to Justin's face. His touch was different now, no longer searching for a seam, but mapping the reality of him. He traced the curve of Justin's cheek, his thumb catching the moisture of a stray tear. "You heard it all," Keith rasped, his eyes searching Justin's with a devastating intensity. "Every pathetic confession. Every time I broke. You watched me fall apart and you just held me." "I wanted to tell you," Justin said, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it was audible in the quiet room. "At the office, every time you looked at me like I was just another line on a spreadsheet, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell you that I was the one who knew how you took your coffee when you were shaking. I wanted to tell you that you weren't a monster. Keith's expression fractured. A low, pained sound escaped his throat as he collapsed forward, burying his face not in the mask, but in the crook of Justin's actual neck. The heat was immediate. The connection was electric, stripped of the barrier of medical-grade rubber. I thought I was losing my mind, Keith choked out, his fingers knotting into Justin's real hair. I was looking at you in those meetings, and I was seeing a ghost. I was falling for two people at once, and I hated myself for it. I felt like I was betraying Ren with you, and betraying you with Ren. Justin wrapped his arms around Keith's waist, pulling him into the chair, letting the CEO's weight crush him. This was the intimacy they had practiced, but the context had shifted from a transaction to a confession. You weren't betraying anyone, Justin whispered into Keith's ear. It's just us. It's always been us. Keith pulled back just enough to look at him, his blue eyes no longer ice, but a churning, stormy sea. He looked at Justin's mouth, the mouth that had been hidden behind a static, silicone smile for weeks. I should fire you, Keith breathed, his face inches from Justin's. For the deception. For the sheer, heart-stopping audacity of this. You already tried that yesterday, Justin reminded him with a faint, daring smile. Keith didn't laugh. Instead, he closed the distance. The kiss wasn't like the cuddling, it wasn't gentle or grounding. It was a desperate, starving collision, a release of weeks of suffocating tension. It was the Ice King finally melting, and Justin was the only one there to catch the flood. Chapter 9, The New Contract. The transition from the suite to the world outside felt like waking up from a dream into a reality that was suddenly, blindingly colorful. For the first week, the office was a minefield of unspoken electricity. Justin sat at his desk in the marketing bay, his eyes fixed on a campaign strategy for the sterling vein recovery, but his skin was hyper-aware of every sound from the executive hallway. When the intercom finally buzzed, the entire floor went silent. Mistra. My office. The tone was the old Keith, crisp, authoritative, unyielding. Justin stood, ignoring the sympathetic winces from his coworkers, and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. But as soon as the door clicked shut and the privacy glass frosted over, the atmosphere shifted. Keith was standing behind his desk, but he wasn't looking at a tablet. He was looking at a small, unassuming brown paper bag. The board is still circling, Keith said, his voice dropping into that private, velvet register. They think I've gone soft because I didn't get the sterling vein marketing team. They don't realize I've finally found a strategy worth keeping. He stepped around the desk. He didn't stop until he was inches away from Justin. There was no desk between them, no silicone mask, and no black tier contract. Just two men in the light of day. I can't be seen holding you in the lobby, Justin, Keith whispered, his hand twitching at his side before finally giving in and brushing Justin's wrist. Not yet. The optics would be problematic. I know, Justin said, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. I'm an analyst, Keith. I know all about optics. But, Keith reached into the brown bag and pulled out a sandwich, something decidedly un-CEO-like from the deli across the street. I realized I don't know what you actually like to eat. I realized that in all those hours of holding me, you never once told me your favorite color. Or your middle name. Or why you started doing that job in the first place. Justin felt a lump form in his throat. The Ice King was trying. He was clumsy at it, navigating the basics of human connection like a man learning a foreign language, but he was trying. It's Alexander, Justin said softly. My middle name. And I started doing it because I think I was looking for someone who needed to be held as much as I did. Keith's expression softened, a look of profound, quiet realization crossing his face. He reached out and, for the first time in the office, he didn't grab or command. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind Justin's ear. Tonight, Keith said, no suite. No agency. Just my apartment. I'll cook, or I'll try to. And we're going to sit, and you're going to tell me everything. And if I'm a terrible conversationalist? Justin teased. Keith leaned in, his forehead resting against Justin's in a gesture that was now their own private language. Then we'll just fall back on what we're good at, Keith breathed. The workday continued. Reports were filed, meetings were held, and the corporate world turned on its axis. But as Justin walked out of the Obsidian Tower that evening, he didn't go to his car to put on a mask. He walked toward the man waiting in the black SUV, a man who was no longer a stranger, no longer a boss, but a partner. The silence had been broken, and in its place, they were finally building something loud, messy, and real.